Hey guys, welcome to the follow-up installment to my theory and analysis video, A Crash Course. If you have not already seen that video, or if you think maybe you'd like to refresh yourself on it, I do encourage you guys to do that before continuing on with this one, because a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about probably won't make much sense if you haven't seen that video. I would add that you can skip the introduction section of that video. There are time codes in the description. The reason I say that is because the things I say in that introduction, at least one of which I'm about to talk about, aren't really relevant anymore. But other than that, like I said, I do encourage you guys to check that out before continuing with this one. So you can do that by clicking the link right here. So yeah, what I was referring to about the introduction of that video, I kind of forgot until I rewatched it in preparation for this. I forgot that the reason that I ended up addressing these crashes, the topic of this video, the reason I did that at the time was because the topic that I was trying to get to back then was what was going on with Ben and the others, basically from the time of the plane crash, the crash of 8/15, really all the way up until the island gets moved, but more specifically the first two seasons where we really don't see things from the others' perspective. We do eventually obviously get some flashbacks to that period and what the others had going on. But as far as what, from the others' perspective, what their plan was with dealing with the 815ers, why did Ben end up getting caught in the net? Was that planned or was that an accident? If it was an accident, why was he out there alone? Yeah, that sort of thing. That was what I was really looking forward to getting to. And that, as I said in the introduction to this video, when I started writing the script for that, like, it just kept becoming longer and longer. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to break that into multiple parts. And I was like, okay, well, I'm spending this much of the script setting up the things that I'm going to be talking about, why Ben was doing what he was doing. I was like, maybe I need to do a video kind of establishing from Ben's perspective what was going on in the earlier years of his leadership. So that's why I originally made this video. That was to be the first of multiple videos kind of leading into, okay, this is the events of the earlier seasons from the others' perspective and why they did the things they did. But in the process of making this video, what this kind of led into was Charles Widmore. By the end of it, I kind of established that Widmore seems to have been behind, at least to some degree, these multiple crashes in this short, 4-year span of time. And so, yeah, the natural progression from there was Charles Widmore. And then what that video ended up turning into was me kind of explaining why I don't think his arc in season 6 makes sense. And then that obviously set up me needing to explain what I think he was actually up to in season 6, and going into all of basically what I see as having been going on in season 6 that I feel there's a lot of evidence to suggest, but I don't think a lot of people see things the way that I do. So I kind of, I want to do a big video on that. I've talked about that probably more than any other video on this channel. That's the one that I've been hinting at and talking about the most. So yeah, basically when I made that Charles Widmore video, that's when suddenly I was like, okay, well, in order to do the other part of that, of explaining what I think he was actually doing and what he actually wanted, I then needed to explain the monster. And so that's why ever since I've been doing all these videos on the monster. So, I've recently outlined in a recent update video, I've talked about what the upcoming series of videos are to be. In case any of you haven't watched that, The upcoming series that I'm doing is about all the apparitions throughout the series, and me kind of going into which ones I think the monster was behind and why I think he was behind them, as well as what I think he was trying to achieve. And then after that series, my next topic will be about the dreams, and it'll be essentially the same thing as the apparitions, where I address each of the dreams we see on screen throughout the series, which ones I think the Man in Black was behind, and why, and what he was trying to achieve with each of them. And then after that, I should be ready to do that Charles Widmore video. What I didn't talk about in that update video is what will come after the Charles Widmore video, because that really has, for a long time, been the thing that I've been building towards. But yeah, after I get to the Charles Widmore video, my next thing will be getting back into what I need to talk about in order to get to the others and what they were up to in the earlier seasons. Things from basically Ben's perspective in those earlier seasons. But yeah, for anyone that may have rewatched this and watched the introduction, yeah, it feels silly to watch it now, because it's like, man, I said I was doing this to get to that, and here we are all this time later, and I still haven't gotten to that. Yeah, I felt like I needed to explain why I've kind of gone off in the direction that I've gone, and assure you that I am still intending to get back to that, and I am very much looking forward to it. That topic is one that really doesn't have anything at all to do with the Man in Black or the monster, and don't get me wrong, I like talking about the monster and its role in the series, but it does feel like that has been all I've been talking about for a long time now. And yeah, it'll be nice to kind of get back to other characters.
We know the Marshal was chasing Kate for 3 years prior to the crash of 815.
Well, somewhere along the way during the 3 years that I was chasing her,
which places this scene at the train station around 2001. And yet, if we look at the money Kate presents to purchase a ticket, we can see the same type of $20 bill Henry's note was written on. The one that wasn't actually introduced until October 2003.
I point to this anachronism as evidence that the production team clearly did not choose this series of $20 bill with its print date in mind. If we can dismiss the train station example as a production error, and we kind of have to, then I would argue it's more than reasonable to conclude the Henry example may have been as well.
Personally, I feel the specific information printed on the license should be regarded as the far more deliberate, and therefore valuable, piece of information provided by the storytellers.
Once again, that's not to say anyone else's interpretation of Henry Gale's timeline is wrong. I am merely addressing this in order to clarify why I feel my interpretation of the timeline, in which Henry arrived around 2001, is not contradicted by the presence of this particular $20 bill. Okay, so I don't have too many comments to go over in this one, but the first one that I did want to talk about is from Shokas, who says, I am in that camp that believes Henry Gale arrived later, and that it was his signal fire we saw on the beach in Exodus, and considering his money was still readable after being buried. I have my own Lost Analysis video series where I go more in depth with that. So yeah, obviously if you guys watched my video last week, you know that I talked about Shokas' channel and recommended one of his videos specifically. Another one that I'm going to recommend in this, because it's related to what he just said, is the one that he did related to the Pillar of Black Smoke. Now in Shokas' video, he does specifically go into the thing that he mentioned about the money being legible, and basically how that, he cites that as being a reason that he thinks that Henry Gale died more recently. My counterpoint to that is, while I'm not too familiar with currency outside of the United States, I am fairly familiar with American currency, and I will say that these bills are in circulation for many, many years. And, you know, they're changing hands and going all over the place, and you know, they tend to last a really long time. So, And then adding in the fact that, yeah, it was buried, presumably in a wallet, but definitely in his pocket. To me, I think that would make it even more likely that it would be preserved and not, in a state of decomposition, than if it were out and about, which again, I think a lot of bills last a lot longer than like the 3 years that my interpretation would suggest that bill was in circulation. I mean, at least. So maybe I should recap real quick what it was I was saying about the $20 bill in this video and Henry Gale's license. So in my video, I talk about how, according to my interpretation of the timeline, I believe Henry Gale arrived on the island around the same time as Desmond, a little bit afterwards, but within the same year, which would have been around 2001. Now, I brought up the $20 bill in my video because I am well aware that in the fandom, people look at that $20 bill and say, oh, this tells us Henry Gale must have arrived after October 2003, because that type of $20 bill was not introduced until October of 2003. And so while I acknowledge the logic there, I felt the need to share why I do not share that opinion or that assessment. And that is because the example that I give is in the episode What Kate Did. We see in her flashback to 2001, she uses the same type of $20 bills at that train station, which is an anachronism. That $20 bill would not have existed at the time that we are seeing depicted on screen. And that to me means that the production team did not have the print dates of these particular bills in mind when they selected those as props. And that to me means that they almost certainly didn't have it in mind when they selected it for the prop of Henry Gale's note. What I do think was intentional on behalf of the production team is the driver's license, because that required them to actually put thought into what dates to print onto it. And what that driver's license says is that it expires in the year 2003, and in Minnesota, licenses are good for 4 years, and they expire on the driver's birthday, which tells us, because we can see the birthday on the driver's license, that this license that Henry Gale had on him expired June 11th, 2003. And it would also mean that it must have been issued at some time in 1999. And so this is the bit of evidence that I find much more worth considering. And it suggests that Henry Gale arrived on the island between 1999 and June 2003. And so obviously, if the license expired in June of 2003, that is 4 months before that $20 bill would have been in circulation. And again, I think that the license is the thing that, I think the dates that the license gives us is a much more deliberate indicator of when Henry Gale arrived on the island. Now, having addressed the $20 bill again, and why I think it's perfectly believable that it would still look fairly fresh, even after having been buried for a few years with Henry Gale. Having said all that, I do think that the idea that the pillar of black smoke was Henry Gale's signal fire, that's a really interesting idea that I had never come across before. So I did actually appreciate that. I thought that was pretty cool. But from a storytelling perspective, I don't love the idea that the events of the season 1 finale, I don't love the idea that they were all kicked off by something that had nothing to do with what Russo said, for one. That would, in that scenario, it would be a major coincidence that Russo comes and talks about the others coming and this pillar of black smoke, and then after that, I mean, within a few hours after that, suddenly Henry Gale's pillar appears. I mean, that would be super convenient for Russo and her story. And I do also think the fact that we see a pillar of black smoke in 1988 when Jen sees it, I do think that there is a connection between those pillars. Obviously, I've talked about this very recently in my follow-up videos to Hearing Voices. The timing of me doing this follow-up kind of worked out because, yeah, this video, Shokasa's comment to this video, and then my series on the Whispers, those are really the only two times that I've ever talked about the Pillar of Black Smoke. So yeah, the timing was kind of cool. But yes, I did recently talk about my interpretation of the Pillars of Black Smoke, both in 2004 and in 1988. And while I do think the circumstances and reasons for both of those pillars are somewhat different, I do think that they are both very much connected to the Man in Black, who we often see depicted as a pillar of black smoke or as a column of black smoke. I do think that, yeah, both of those pillars were linked to him and what he was trying to achieve at that time. And as I also said in one of those videos, I think the fact that we see that pillar of black smoke in the season 1 finale, and that the season 1 finale is also the very first time we see that the monster appears as a column of black smoke, I do not think that that is a coincidence. I think this is the story telling us that these things are somehow linked. And so, yeah, for those reasons, along with my interpretation of the timeline in which Henry Gale died years before 815 crashed, for all of those reasons, I personally don't have the interpretation that the pillar of black smoke we see in season 1 was lit by Henry Gale. But again, I do encourage you guys to check out Shokasa's video on that, because he does go into a bit more detail. And there are things that he says that do make sense, including the fact that Henry Gale mentions in his note that he is going to hike to a beach and light a fire. And that it makes sense that if the others see that big pillar of black smoke, that might have been how they intercepted Henry Gale and interrogated him to begin with. Now, I'm going to come back to another thing that Shokasa says here in a minute, but real quick, I want to address a comment from Lethologica02.
Charles Widmore was banished from the island by Ben around 1993. At that time, he more or less threatened vengeance upon Ben.
I'll be seeing you, boy.
Years later, he also expresses his intention to reclaim the island as his own.
That island's mine, Benjamin. It always was. It will be again.
It therefore stands to reason that Widmore's subsequent funding of adventures across the Pacific, such as Desmond's and Henry's, may have been in an effort to locate the island. Consider the following hypothetical scenario. Charles Widmore takes steps to secretly track the participants in each of his sailing races. When Desmond goes missing in 2001, Widmore then funds Henry Gale's trip across the Pacific, in the process ensuring the charted course takes the balloon through the same region Desmond disappeared in. If Widmore tracks the balloon, and it too goes missing in that same area, this would more or less verify the approximate location of the island. At this point, the others would have good reason to fear Widmore now knows their location, and this would call for the drastic measure of moving the island. In previous videos, I've noted that Ben seems to have moved the island before. That is, prior to when we see him move it in Season 4. This is based on his familiarity with the chamber, as well as his interaction with the Tunisian hotel clerk.
Is this your first time in Tunisia?
No, but it's been a while.
So continuing on with our hypothetical scenario, what if upon moving the island, Ben arrived at the exit at the point in 2001, right when the Nigerian Beechcraft was passing over on its way to Tunisia? This then would have likely resulted in the plane crossing that rift in space-time to the island on the other side, causing it to suddenly appear above the Orchid Station before the resulting turbulence caused it to crash.
So yeah, I'm going to address the first part of this comment, and then the second part of it is actually along the same lines of the second part of Shokasa's comment that I want to address. But yeah, so first I'm going to start with the first portion of this. I've never had a headcanon that I've fully prescribed to for the Beechcraft and Henry Gale. I did believe that Henry was an unknowing agent of Widmore, but I never thought that he might have been sent due to Desmond's disappearance. I wonder if Widmore's relationship with Eloise allowed him to learn through her that Desmond's disappearance was island-related instead of just a normal shipwreck. Okay, so the part of that I wanted to address is how Widmore would have known that Desmond ended up on the island. Because I do think, and I've probably addressed this a little bit somewhere else at some point on the channel, but a lot of people seem to look at Widmore's relationship with Eloise and assume that all of the knowledge about the future that she was privy to from Faraday's journal, he was also privy to. This is not something that I agree with. I am very much of the opinion that the fact that their relationship was already complicated, as indicated by Richard.
The man you're asking about, Jack, is Charles Widmore. He and Eloise are... well, it's nice to say love can be complicated.
And then the fact that we know what happens after the incident is that Widmore becomes leader in place of Eloise, and Eloise ends up off island, never to return, from what we can tell, raising their son alone. I think the chances that these two parted on good terms is extremely unlikely. We do know that they are both eventually willing to sacrifice their son, but I don't think that they have the same reasons for being willing to do that.
Don't you talk to me about sacrifice, Charles. I had to send my son back to the island, knowing full well that...
It's my son too, Eloise.
It's not until around the time that Faraday is 8 years old, so about 1985, that she suddenly decides that she has to commit Daniel to this path and sacrifice him. I think the fact that she walks into the room where Daniel is playing the piano and she's crying, that's how she enters the room before she decides to convince him, okay, yeah, you can't be playing the piano anymore. You have to focus on your destiny, what you're destined to become. I think that's meant to suggest to us that something happens around that time that convinces her that she needs to basically raise her son for the slaughter. And I do think that that is a completely separate motive from Widmore, who I think is just trying to serve his own selfish ends. He wants to reclaim the island, and he knows that Daniel being on that freighter and ultimately time traveling, he knows that that's all part of the sequence of events that will lead to him returning to the island and reclaiming it. And the reason I think he knows the things that he knows regarding this future sequence of events, including the fact that Desmond will end up on the island, I think that all comes from Matthew Abaddon. For the purposes of this video, we don't need to go into my interpretation of Abaddon and how he knows what he knows. We don't need to go back over that again. What is undeniable is that Abaddon demonstrates from as early as the year 2000, shortly after Locke ends up in a wheelchair, he demonstrates that he knows future events. He knows that Locke will eventually end up on the island, and that the reason he eventually ends up on the island is because he was trying to go on a walkabout. And years later, in 2007, when Locke and him reunite, and they discuss this original encounter, Abaddon fully acknowledges that what he said to Locke is what led him to eventually ending up on the island. And he then says that what he does and what he does for Widmore is make sure that people end up where they're supposed to end up. And so if Abaddon is working for or working with Widmore, it means that Widmore would be privy to Abaddon's knowledge of the future, or at least as much of it as Abaddon is willing to share. Now, someone could potentially argue that I'm looking at it backwards, and Widmore's knowledge of the future is informing Abaddon's actions. And basically, it is Widmore sharing his knowledge of the future with Abaddon that is the reason behind Abaddon seeming to know the things that he seems to know. The issue with that idea is that there's no reason at all that Faraday should have even known, let alone wrote about in his journal, that Locke ended up on the island because he was in a wheelchair and he wanted to go on a walkabout. There's no reason that should have been in the journal, and as far as I can tell, there's no other way that Widmore could have known about that. We obviously know that the teenage Widmore interacts with John Locke in 1954, but he doesn't know anything about his past as far as him ending up in a wheelchair and going on a walkabout. The only thing Richard learns about Locke's future is that he will eventually become leader, and he learns when he will be born. So the way that I see it, the only way that Abaddon could know to tell John what he tells him is if Abaddon himself has knowledge of the future that is independent from what Eloise knows and from what Widmore may or may not know. And so if Abaddon is his own independent source of knowledge of future events, and he is working with Widmore, that then explains Widmore's knowledge of the future, without him having to have had access to Faraday's journal, the way Eloise does. So getting back to Lethologica 02's comment, I do think that Widmore knew well in advance of Desmond setting sail that Desmond was going to end up on the island. And I also think that he was trying to influence events so that Desmond would participate in that race. Because again, he wants to manipulate what he knows of this sequence of events to reach the outcome that he wants. And so I think that that is why he shows up outside the military prison and tries to give Desmond all this money. He wants Desmond to take his money to buy a boat and participate in this race. And then to continue on with that, once Desmond does disappear, Widmore would already know that he did end up on the island. The purpose I think funding Henry Gale's balloon journey would serve is establishing the path of the island. Eloise tells us in the episode 316 that the island is always moving. It sounds like it's always adrift. And so if you know approximately where Desmond disappeared from, and you then send the balloon and track it and establish exactly where that goes missing, that would not only tell you more or less the exact location of the island at the time that Henry Gale disappears, but when you combine that with the approximate location of Desmond's disappearance, that gives you an idea of the path of the island. But beyond that, I think the real motivation of Widmore sending Henry Gale after Desmond arrives on the island, I think the motivation is to motivate Ben to move the island and to leave the island. Again, if Widmore knows the sequence of future events, he knows that Desmond and Henry Gale's arrivals on the island, that does not immediately lead to him reclaiming the island. He knows that that happens years later. So his motive for sending these two individuals on separate trips, his main motive would not be to pinpoint the location of the island, because ultimately that's not going to matter in the immediate future. So I think what his main goal was to get Ben to move the island, which in my headcanon affords Widmore certain opportunities to get revenge on Ben once he has come to the outside world. And I do think that this is the period in time in which the photo that we see Widmore had given to Miles of Ben off island, I think that is when that picture was taken, in that period of time. Now, on the topic of Ben moving the island, that leads into the second part of both Lethologica 02's comment and Shokasa's comment. So let me start by finishing Lethologica 02's. Ben moving the island because of both Desmond and Henry is an interesting idea that I really like. But it makes me wonder what year Ben appeared in the Tunisian desert then, how he made it back to the island, and why he insisted that someone who turns the wheel can't return to the island if true. I suppose these questions will be addressed in a future video,
It's also an interesting thought that the wormhole that deposited Ben in Tunisia could have grabbed the Beechcraft. I guess that would mean Ben appeared in Tunisia in 2001, but that would mean Ben was absent from the island for around 10 years. So first of all, after we had a bit of a back and forth, Lethologico2 says he doesn't know why he said 10 years, that he thinks he was doing the math from the time that Widmore was exiled. But yes, I do think that Ben moved the island in 2001, shortly after the arrivals of Desmond and Henry Gale, and I think that he ended up at another point in 2001. In my headcanon, I think that he ended up earlier in 2001, and this is another story that I have in my head that I would like to tell in some form at some point. But yeah, I think that when he arrives earlier in 2001, I think there are a series of events in which he is trying to prevent Henry Gale from being sent to the island to begin with, and in which he is trying to evade capture by Widmore and his people. I think this is when Ben first encounters Abaddon, for example. And I think there are a series of things that cause him to be cut off from his resources, and that is why he has a tough time getting back to the island. Basically, I think that Widmore is aware of Ben's off-island resources, and in order for Ben to access them, that would risk him getting captured. And basically, I think that the things that happen in this time period, I think these are the catalyst for Ben's transition from the more benevolent leader that we see around the time of Widmore's exile to the much more selfish and deceptive, manipulative leader that we know Ben is at the time 815 crashes. Again, I've talked about before how one of the things that Widmore is criticizing Ben for when Widmore is being exiled is him not being willing to do certain things, certain extreme things, in order to protect the island. The thing he's specifically talking about is not being willing to kill Alex. We also know he wasn't willing to kill Danielle, at least not after finding out she had a kid. The Ben that we see by 2004 is much more willing to kill innocent people just to get what he wants. And I've long felt that there's an interesting story to be told in between these time periods as to some of the reasons that Ben has kind of... Hey guys, this is Editor Chris. I realized that there was actually something else that Lethologico2 had said in our conversation that I thought was worth addressing, but that I didn't end up filming. So yeah, I thought I would add this in the editing phase. So yeah, I'm going to read the highlighted portion here now. In your reply, you've posited that it moved him to the past instead of the future, which is certainly possible. We were told that turning the wheel is a measure of last resort because of how chaotic the result is. If the island can end up anywhere in space, on Earth, due to the turning of the wheel, presumably the wheel turner could end up anywhere in time, past or future. But for some reason, we only ever see the wheel move people into the future. And when 2005 Ben arrives in his Tunisian hotel, he correctly guesses that he has been moved forward in time rather than not knowing whether he has been moved to the past or future, which is a little odd. So I wonder if it is a better assumption that, just as the island can move anywhere in space as long as it's on Earth and presumably still in the ocean, maybe the turner can move anywhere in time as long as it's in the future. Okay, so yeah, there's actually quite a bit there that I want to go over. So I want to start with the island and how it moves in space. This is something that I will undoubtedly be doing in a scripted... I'll undoubtedly be addressing this in a scripted video at some point. And when that time comes, I'll have done some actual research to make sure that this makes sense. But my basic thoughts on it right now, as for why it always ends up at sea, instead of, just materializing like in the middle of Iowa or something crazy like that. So yeah, my thoughts on that are basically, well, so let me use the comparison that, so when Locke and Faraday and Charlotte and all them are dislodged in time and they keep flashing throughout the island's history, they always end up in the same, like they're always in the same place, no matter what time they flash to. They're in the same place they were when they flashed from the last time. This tells us that, and we know that the island is always moving and adrift. So in relation to the Pacific, let's say, or in relation to North America or Australia or whatever else, Locke and the other time travelers, they're not materializing in the same place. This tells us that when they're flashing through time, this is happening in relation to the source or the orchid pocket of energy, which is essentially the same thing. But yeah, basically they are traveling in relation to that. And so when it comes to the island moving and it not ending up, like I said, in the middle of a continent or in the middle of space, I think that it is. We already know that the source and the island's electromagnetism, it's connected to other pockets of electromagnetism all over the world. But I also think that it is like its pattern of drifting, which can apparently be mathematically calculated. I think that is in relation to the Earth's core, because we know that the Earth's core is basically a big electromagnet. And so I think of the island's source, they have an effect on each other. Kind of like the same sides of two magnets kind of repel each other. I think that that's kind of how the source and the Earth's core work. And I think when the island is moved, it goes somewhere where it's approximately the same distance from the Earth's core with the same amount of mass between them. So that's why it's, it starts out in the ocean, it stays in the ocean. If it were to go onto land, then there would be much more mass between the source and the Earth's core. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of late at night, and I'm just kind of saying that off the top of my head. Like I said, when I eventually talk about that in a scripted video, I'll probably do some more research and see if there's a better way to explain that. But yeah, that's kind of how at this time I think of why the island always ends up at sea. Like it never ends up. There's never a significant risk of it ending up on land. Okay, but going back to the time portion of Lethologico 2's comment, he mentions that we only ever see the wheel turners come out in the future. And this is true, but I think it's important to note that we only ever see two people turn the wheel and when they end up in relation to that, to them doing that. So I don't think 2 instances of us seeing that is enough to establish a pattern, in my opinion. Yeah, the thing that I said in response to that too was like there's no known law of physics that differentiates the past from the future. That's only our perception of time. There's also the law of entropy, but when you're talking about opening a wormhole through space-time, entropy doesn't really have anything to do with that. So, yeah, there would be no difference in between past and future. So I find the idea that somebody would only ever be transported into the future, that would be kind of, it wouldn't really make sense, because yeah, in the hypothetical example I use is because, like, if you look at time as the 4th dimension of space-time, if you kind of translate this scenario into a more three-dimensional example, like say you have a machine that can teleport matter from one spot in space to another spot in space. In the four-dimensional example, saying that somebody would only go into the future, that would be like saying in the three-dimensional example that, oh, this machine can teleport stuff, but only to the west. Like that, like you get what I'm saying? Like there would be no, that wouldn't make any sense, because why would this technology, why would this capability only be capable of doing that in an arbitrary, subjective direction? I have a video on the channel that I promote every so often about time travel and storytelling specifically. So yeah, I'll recommend that again here. I've long been fascinated by that topic, and yeah, I think the video is a pretty good exploration of that type of stuff. But anyways, I think the only part of Lethologic 02's comment here that I haven't addressed is the part where Ben correctly guesses the year when he gets to the hotel. Yeah, the way that I see that, I think that he arrives, and I think he rides into town. I think there's enough context clues that he probably runs into where he can safely assume that he is not drastically like far off from the time that he came from. For example, the passport that he gives the hotel clerk, we know that he didn't bring that with him to the Orchid Station. There's actually a deleted scene where he retrieves the passport and maybe some other things. I think cash, probably. He retrieves those from a stash in the desert. And obviously this is a deleted scene, so it's not necessarily canon anymore. But the fact that we never see him grab a passport and cash on the island, and it's unlikely he had them on him when he's taken by the mercenary team, for example, we can assume that he did off-screen retrieve those things from a stash somewhere. And so if he's having people within his network off-island keep such documents stashed for him in case he needs them, then the expiration dates of those documents would be a type of context clue. So, based on what he finds stashed, that would give him a vague idea of what year he's in. And so when he asks her the date, and she tells him October the 24th, I think that's what she says. Instead of asking what year it is, in that even more bizarre way of just saying, and what year is it? He offers up 2005, which I think at that point, based on him coming into town and the context clues and everything, I think that was probably a safe bet. I think he had kind of figured out what year it was. He just didn't necessarily know the exact date. So yeah, he kind of puts forth the year 2005, and she confirms it. And he's like, oh, okay, cool. That's the way I read that scene anyways. But okay, back into the filmed portion of this video.
Now there's a part of what Lethologic 02 said there that I haven't addressed yet, and Shokos raises the same point when he says, fair assessment that the island was moved in 2001. I like that. I can subscribe to that. I just wonder why Ben would have said that whoever moves the island can never come back if he had already done it a few years earlier. To me, it seemed like this event in the season 4 finale was Ben's first time he moved the island, and his tears over never returning and giving the leadership to John suggest that. Of course, Ben knew that it meant to move the island, and I think he saw it being done when he was a teenager. My headcanon is that Eloise turned the wheel, and that's why we never see her back on the island. And it's not that you can't return, it's just that it seemed like Ben believed you couldn't return, until he was told otherwise, perhaps by Eloise herself. First of all, I want to address the idea that Eloise turned the wheel. This would certainly have been in 1977. I am under the impression that most people agree, and I believe this goes for Shokos as well, that the incident in 1977 and the existence of the swan thereafter is what causes the pregnancy issues. From what I can tell, this is a pretty widely agreed upon conclusion. And if we accept that as true, that would mean that Eloise would have had to have left the island before giving birth to Daniel. Otherwise, she would not have survived it. And so, as I've said before, I do think that Eloise left willingly shortly after the incident, because I do think that Faraday's journal detailed the fertility issues. And if he himself had not concluded it was because of this incident, which I think is likely by this point, when he returns to the island in 1977, he suddenly has reached all of these conclusions about the incident. I think it's very likely that he deduced that the fertility issues came from this, or that fertility issues would result from this incident. And I think for that reason, Eloise reading that, she willingly leaves the island so that she and her child will not die. And I think at that point, she gives Widmore control of the island. I think that that is her last act as leader. And I guess I can go ahead and elaborate a bit more, since it's kind of on topic, regarding the nature of their relationship as they parted ways. I think that, again, the relationship already seemed complicated based on what Richard says to Jack and Kate. But I think that a lot of what is detailed in Faraday's journal, I think among the facts that are in there are the fact that Widmore himself is the one that sent Faraday to the island. I think that that was likely to make Eloise wary of having Widmore around her son. Because again, keep in mind, after she kills Faraday, her immediate response is to join forces with these people that she does not know in the hopes that she can undo what she just did. So at this stage, she is not of the mindset that she needs to make sure events happen the way that they're destined to happen. And as I said earlier in this video, I think it is not until 8 years later, around 1985, that she does finally come to that conclusion. That it's 8 years later that she accepts her role in ensuring things happen the way that they happen. So yeah, if she's leaving the island in 1977 so that her and her child survive, I think that at that point in time, she is also hoping that she can prevent her son from growing up and suffering this fate. And I think what she reads in that journal indicates or suggests that the Widmore of the future willingly sent Faraday there knowing what was going to happen to him. And I think at this point in time for Eloise in 1977, that appalls her. I think that the idea that this future version of Widmore would do that, I think that makes her want to keep him away from her child. And so I think appointing him as leader, which she knows is what he really wants anyways, I think that is her way of keeping him away from her and keeping him away from her son. Another thing worth noting that's kind of related to this, I think it kind of suggests what I'm saying about Eloise and Widmore not working together to push Faraday to this fate, is the fact that in Faraday's flashback to around 1996, when he graduates, he's telling his mother that he got a grant from some industrialist. And she's not surprised to hear that. She's not surprised to hear that somebody is trying to fund Faraday's research. What she is surprised about immediately after that is when Faraday reveals that this industrialist is Charles Widmore. She seemed to be expecting that an industrialist was funding Faraday, but she didn't expect it to be Widmore at this point in time.
Grant? That's wonderful. From whom?
I don't know. Some industrialist. Widmore, I think. Charles Widmore.
But yeah, I'm going on a whole other tangent again. What I was trying to address is this idea that Eloise moved the island in 1977. Because again, it would have to be 1977 if we accept the fact that Faraday could not have been born on the island, otherwise they would have both died. The issue that I have with that idea that she would move the island at this time is the effect of that energy on pregnant women. I do not believe at all that a pregnant woman could go and move the island and release all that energy, be right next to that pocket, and then be subjected and bombarded by that and then transported off island. I don't think that they could survive that. And I do think that that is suggested by the Hydra orientation film that we see in the epilogue, where Pierre specifically says not to bring pregnant polar bears to the Orchid Station because the levels of electromagnetism at that station are extremely harmful to early-term pregnancies.
Remember, be sure to confirm that the female bears have not been impregnated before transport, as the electromagnetic levels at the Orchid have an extremely harmful effect on early-term gestation.
So yes, I do think that Eloise left the island in 1977, but I do not think that that is how she left. And so for those reasons, I also don't think that Ben witnessed her leaving and assumed that the reason she never came back was because she wasn't allowed to or wasn't able to. But getting to the thing that Shokos and Lethological 2 both say, they both bring up this idea that Ben says that the person that moves the island can never come back. And Shokos specifically cites Ben's emotional reaction, which obviously isn't a show, like nobody's around, so he's not doing that as a deception or a manipulation of anyone. He cites that as evidence that Ben really believed that what he was doing meant that he was not allowed to come back. So I've actually talked about this in multiple videos since they commented their comments. But since it did come up in relation to this video, I did want to try and go back over all of my thoughts related to this and try and compile them maybe more succinctly than I have in the past. We'll see. But okay, so I'm trying to think of where to start with this. So, because there are other things that people have brought up about this idea that Ben moved the island before, including the idea that the way we see him access that chamber in 2004 is by blowing through the test chamber in the Orchid. And obviously that hadn't been done before. So that means in order for Ben to have moved the island before, he would have had to have accessed it through other means. And I think it's fair to say that the well was filled in at this point in time, based on the fact that Sawyer and his group, when they're time traveling, they arrive in 1974 and the well is filled in. So yeah, we know that the well, it's very unlikely that the well was ever dug up. But what I have said elsewhere and what I will say again is that if you look, when Ben blasts through that wall in the season 4 finale, he emerges into a tunnel. It's a very cramped, small tunnel, but it leads to an old wooden ladder, which leads down into the antechamber of the wheel. And you have the lantern and the hieroglyphs and all that stuff. What I'm pointing out is that whoever put that ladder there, it obviously wasn't Dharma. Dharma, I've got to back up and say that. Dharma did not seem to ever access the wheel. We see in the season 5 premiere that when the construction crew is coming up on the wheel and the construction worker is saying they need to blast through the wall to get there, Pierre Chang is adamant that they do not do that, that it is too dangerous. And so what they do instead is they construct that test chamber adjacent to that pocket.
There's something in there. And the only way to get to it is to lay charges here and here. Blast through and take a look.
Under no circumstances.
So what do you want me to do?
You're gonna do nothing. If you drill even 1 centimeter further, you risk releasing that energy. If that were to happen, God help us all.
Also, I want to add that as adamant as Pierre was in that moment that they should not blast any further or drill any further, he would have been even more adamant about that after the incident happens within the next couple days. So yeah, I do not think this is something that he would have backtracked on at all. Another thing that has come up before when talking about this is the polar bears and how they end up in the Sahara Desert. Some people have concluded that Dharma must have used the polar bears to turn the wheel. I do not think that that is true. It is just that tunnel that we see Ben crawl through. It's too small. We don't see any other obvious big tunnels that they could have gotten the polar bears through to that wheel. Even if other tunnels did exist, and yeah, that was kind of what I was saying before I went off on this. I do think that the tunnel that Ben comes out into, I do think that extends the other way off screen that we don't see. But again, you do see how cramped and tiny that tunnel is. And it is very deep beneath the surface of the island.
How deep is the station? Deep.
So yeah, it is not at all believable to me that the polar bears were navigated to that depth through such cramped space. It's not believable to me that there's some off-screen tunnel that's big enough for the polar bears that would go that deep. Yeah, I don't think that's what happened. I think what happened to the polar bears was the experiments they were doing in the chamber that they built, which I've agreed with Shokas before when he said that it does not seem to be built with polar bears in mind. I agree. I think it was originally built for the rabbits, but I think the rabbits kept dying in these experiments because of how cold the energy was, at which point they started bringing over the polar bears from Hydra Island, which they were already doing zoological research on, because they're more adaptable to cold temperatures, or, since they can handle the cold temperatures, they started bringing them over, and they started putting them in the test chambers. And I think that as these experiments went on, probably on more than one occasion, the fact that they were tapping into that pocket of energy, it makes sense that it could result in the bears being shot out to that same point in the Sahara Desert. I mentioned that to Lethologico too, and he had responded. The polar bear that Charlotte finds in the desert, the other archaeologists find, paleontologists, whatever they were. The polar bear that is found in the Tunisian desert, the skeleton, has a tracking collar on it. And the Hydra orientation, Pierre tells the Hydra workers to put that tracking collar on them. So yeah, Lethologica 2 was saying the fact that they were putting those trackers on them, he thinks means that they were intentionally transporting them out to that desert. In my head, it was probably an accident the first time it happened. I think that after that first time, I think that they probably started putting the trackers on them to try and find out where they were going. So yeah, in a sense, I think after that first time, I guess they would have been doing it on purpose because, yeah, they were trying to figure out where they were going. So yeah, I would agree that the tracking collar does probably suggest a degree of intentionality in the polar bears going somewhere. But I definitely don't think that it was the act of turning the wheel that caused them to be transported. But okay, now that I've addressed the polar bear situation again, yeah, how Ben would have accessed the chamber previously. As I had started to say, when he blasts through the wall, he goes to the left, and then there's the ladder. I don't think that whoever put the ladder there, because now I've established it wasn't Dharma because they were not wanting to access the actual chamber. I don't think that whoever put the ladder there, probably well before Dharma, would have done so. I don't think they would have put a ladder up to a tunnel that just dead ends. I think that ladder led up into a tunnel that would have slowly worked its way back up to the surface, back up to the point where it connects to the Egyptian tunnels that we see are much closer to the surface and are much bigger. Now, as for why Ben would not have used that same path down, all the way down, in 2004, I think that there are a couple of possible reasons for that. I think it's possible that somewhere along the way that tunnel could have collapsed in the time between. But even if that isn't the case, time is a much more crucial factor in 2004. They know that the mercenaries are on their way back to the island. They know that the freighter is just off of the island. Because these threats are much more immediate, I think that this meant that Ben knew that the quickest way to get to the wheel and move the island was to just blast through the Orchid Station wall. But now, finally getting to what Ben says to Locke about not being able to come back, this is something else I've talked about separately. I've talked about the reasons why Richard and the others were done with Ben as a leader. Ben had abused his power severely by this point. First, by ordering the attack on the beach camp at the end of season 3, at which time he authorized the use of lethal force against anybody that got in their way. So he was essentially ordering genocide. That was basically the last order he had given to his people before he went off and got captured by the 815ers, at which point we know his people never came and tried to rescue him. At least not until he made contact with them with the mirror, and seemed to have made the arrangement in which they would rescue him from the mercenaries once he turned himself into them. And again, as I've talked about before, I think that the reason they agreed to rescue him from that situation, I think a condition of that was that Ben would then willingly step aside, let Locke become the leader, and Ben would leave the island. And just like the leaders before him, the best example being Widmore, he would not be welcome to come back at that point. He would be banished because he had failed as their leader and he was being rejected as the leader. So yeah, I think those were the conditions of them saving him. I think Ben knew that. So when he's going to leave the island, and again, he has other reasons for wanting to leave. He makes that deal with the others, with his people. He makes that deal that he will leave, but he also wants to leave at this point because he wants to get revenge on Widmore for Alex's death.
Widmore. You'll find him.
Not if I find him first.
Add in the factor that Locke was apparently told by Jacob that the island needed to be moved in order to protect it. Again, from Ben's perspective, this was Jacob that told Locke this. Now he's got 3 different reasons for him needing to move the island. Because A, the island needs to be moved to protect it. B, because he has agreed with his people that he will leave. And C, he wants to leave so that he can pursue revenge on Widmore. Now, when Ben tells Locke that whoever moves the island can never come back, he is telling him this because Locke is really angry at Ben at this point because of what Ben just did with Kimi. He just killed him knowing that that would cause the freighter to explode and get a bunch of people killed. Locke is furious at Ben for this. And so then when Ben is saying that, okay, Locke, you're not actually going to move the island, I am, Locke is mad about that too. Like, no, I was told I needed to do it. So in order to shut John up, first of all, but also to kind of repair that damaged trust from what just happened, Ben presents him moving the island. He presents this as this noble sacrifice he's making, and he's using that as the reason that he is being banished, and not the horrible actions that he committed. He isn't confessing to John, or he isn't confiding in John the more despicable reasons that he will no longer be welcomed on the island by his people. And yeah, considering that John goes from being furious at Ben for what he just did, getting a bunch of people killed, to shaking his hand and wishing him well, I think this is another excellent manipulation on Ben's part of John. And again, instead of painfully admitting, the actual reasons for his banishment, he is presenting it as this heroic thing that he's doing. And in the process, this manipulates John into retaining some trust in Ben, which Ben can later exploit. And I would argue he does. But now, getting to the part where Ben is in that chamber alone, and he says, he looks up and he says, "I hope you're happy now, Jacob." And then he does seem to be emotional when he's turning that wheel. I agree with all of that. I think what he is reacting to is the fact that he is being banished, that he is leaving the island, and this means being exiled. What I disagree with is the notion that it is the act of moving the island that is the reason for that. It's everything I just went into. I think he is emotional about leaving. I think he does say what he says because he is being banished. But he is also doing this one last act in service of Jacob, at least as he sees it, because again, he thinks that Jacob gave this order to move the island. Yeah, for all of those reasons, I think it makes sense, the emotional reaction that Ben is having in that moment. But yeah, I do not think that the act of moving the island itself equals banishment. So yeah, that's, like I said, I've said pretty much all of that. I think I've said all of that in previous videos, but I don't think I've said it all in one sitting. So I wanted to try and do that here because, again, it is relevant to what I said in this video about the idea that Ben had moved the island previously. But okay, I think that's everything I have for this one. So yeah, just as a reminder of what's coming next, a week after this comes out, you should be seeing the first episode in my next theory and analysis series, which will be all about the apparitions we see throughout the show. I've said before that my outline for that was 8 parts. That has since become 7 because as I actually got into the writing phase and not just the outlining, I realized that the first part that I was going to do, I've actually accidentally already talked about in my past several videos. My first section was going to be about the corporeal forms of the monster, the apparitions, if you will, that we know were him, and going into what he was trying to accomplish with each of those. But over the course of my videos about the monster himself and his abilities, then the one about the infection, and then the one about the whispers, I realized anything I had to say about those, I've already covered in those videos. So I can actually just kind of skip over that and just move straight into the apparitions I haven't addressed yet. So yeah, like I've said before, it's going to be 8 parts. It's actually going to be 7. And yeah, that should be starting up. You should be seeing those once a week, starting next week. These videos, this video that you're seeing now, and then the last 2 follow-ups, the ones for hearing voices, I've been releasing those at 8 p.m. my time, which is 9 p.m. Eastern time or New York time. That is 8 hours. No, I'm sorry. That's 9 hours later than I was releasing my theory and analysis series For the episodes of my theory and analysis series, I kind of like the idea of doing the premieres where I kind of set the time that they're coming out, and then, you know, we can kind of watch the video together when it first comes out, whoever, you know, is available to do that. That's something I would like to keep trying out, but I am curious if there's a preference for the time that those videos are released. Do you guys want those to come out at the time they were coming out, which was noon New York time? Would that make more of you likely to tune in for the premiere? Or do most of you not really care what time they come out and you kind of just watch them whenever you get a chance to anyways? Yeah, I'm looking for feedback on that. You guys can comment that on this video, but I will throw up a poll between this video's release and the first episode of the Theory and Analysis series. Yeah, I'll throw up a poll on the YouTube community page and see if you guys have a preference at all. But okay, that is everything. I hope to see you guys next time. And so I think that is why he shows up outside the military prison and tries to give Desmond all this money. He wants Desmond to take his money to buy a boat and participate in this race. I did kind of hint at something in this video that I'm kind of hinting at again now. So far, nobody seemed to pick up on it, but I think this might be a little bit more explicit. The fact that Desmond refuses the money would, in theory, you know, kind of throw a wrench in Widmore's plan of trying to get Desmond to end up on the island. And that may have required him to find another way to ensure that Desmond could participate in this race. Oh, you're still here. Hopefully that means you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider sticking around and being a constant for this channel by clicking right up here to subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon if you would like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive. In the meantime, feel free to check out previous content from this channel by clicking here or here. Oh no. Please subscribe.